The bone key fit the chest too perfectly, and when it turned, a song spilled out that knew Theo's heart better than he did. The key sang to him before he even touched it, a low humming that seemed to rise from the bone itself like smoke from dying embers. Theo had been walking the midnight bazaar for 20 minutes, his leather satchel of tools clinking softly against his hip. When the melody first reached his ears, the bazaar appeared only when the clock tower struck 12, materializing from the mist that rolled in from the harbor like a secret whisper into being. Vendors emerged from shadows with their curious wares spread on velvet cloths, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, their voices carrying accents from places that perhaps no longer existed on any map. Theo had discovered this place 3 months ago, quite by accident, when a late-night call had brought him to the old warehouse district. A broken lock on a shipping container, the client had said. Simple work, but when he finished and turned to leave, the mist had parted like curtains, and there it was, a market that sold things ordinary shops would never dare display. Tonight, like every night since, he found himself drawn back, not for any particular need, mind you. Theo Aldrich was a practical man, a locksmith by trade and by nature, who believed in the weight of good steel and the precision of well-oiled tumblers. But there was something about this place, something that spoke to a part of him he'd thought long buried, beneath years of routine service calls and straightforward deadbolts. In decades, instead, it held a pool of still black liquid that reflected not the stars above, but deeper things, memories, perhaps, or dreams that belonged to no one living. Lanterns hung from twisted iron posts, their flames dancing in colors that had no names, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The air smelled of cinnamon and old parchment, of rain on cobblestones, and something else, something like the inside of a jewelry box that hadn't been opened in a very long time. Theo moved between the stalls with practiced ease now, to the woman who sold mirrors that showed not your reflection but your truest self, stepping carefully around the man who offered bottled laughter and tears in equal measure. These vendors had grown accustomed to his presence, this ordinary locksmith who appeared each midnight with wonder still bright in his eyes. Despite his 43 years, it was near the fountain that he found the new stall. The vendor was younger than the others, or perhaps older. It was difficult to tell in the shifting light. Her hair fell in dark waves over a shawl the color of twilight, and her fingers, long and pale, moved with surgical precision as she arranged her wares. Before him, on a cloth that might once have been white, but now held the patina of age, lay dozens of keys. But these were not keys, as Theo knew them. Each one had been carved from boneson, yellowed with age, others polished to an ivory gleam. They varied in size from delicate things no larger than his thumb to massive specimens that would require 2 hands to lift. Some bore intricate etchings that seemed to shift and flow when he looked at them directly, while others were smooth as river stones. And from each one came a soft, barely audible humming, like wind through a half-closed door. The woman looked up as he approached, and Theo found himself meeting eyes the color of deep water. "You're the locksmith," she said, and it wasn't a question. Her voice carried the same musical quality as her keys, each word pitched in harmonious intervals. "I've been waiting for you." Theo felt a small thrill of unease, the kind that made him check over his shoulder, waiting for me. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." She smiled, and the expression transformed her face entirely. "We haven't, not in this life, but you know me, I think, just as I know you." She gestured to her display. "These keys are very old, carved from the bones of creatures that once walked between worlds. Each one opens something different, a door, a heart, a memory long forgotten. Would you like to see?" Theo's practical mind told him to walk away. He dealt in modern locks, in mechanisms that could be explained and understood, not in mystical artifacts carved from bone by lamplight. But something about the keys called to him, the way they hummed together in imperfect harmony, creating melodies that seemed almost familiar. "What do they open?" he heard himself ask. The woman's smile deepened. "That depends on who holds them. For some, they open doors that were never meant to stay closed. For others, they unlock the chains that bind the soul." She reached for a key near the center of the display, one carved from bone so white it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Along its shaft, intricate letters had been etched in a script that looked almost like his own handwriting. "This one, though this one, is special." Theo leaned closer, and his breath caught. There, carved into the bone in delicate script, were his initials, T.A. Theodore Aldrich. But the carving was old, far older than his 43 years, worn smooth by countless hands and time itself. "How is that possible?" he whispered. The woman held the key out to him, and he could hear its song more clearly now, melody that seemed to speak of home, of belonging, of answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. "Some things exist before they are made," she said softly. "Some names are written in the bone before the child is born. This key has been waiting for you much longer than you might imagine." Theo reached for it before he could stop himself. The moment his fingers touched the bone, warmth spread up his arm, and the melody grew stronger. Images flashed behind his Isa workshop filled with tools he'd never owned. Hands that looked like his, but weren't quite his, working by candlelight on locks of impossible complexity. A woman with dark hair and knowing eyes, reaching for him across a vast distance. And somewhere, always somewhere in the background, the sound of singing. "What does it open?" he asked, though part of him already knew he would take the key, regardless of the answer. The woman gestured toward the fountain, where the black water had begun to ripple despite the still air. "There's a chest at the bottom of that pool. It has been waiting there since before this market began, before this city was built, before." The first locksmith hung out his shingle and promised to open what was closed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It contains a song, Theo, a song that remembers who you were before you became who you are." The practical part of his mind screamed warnings, but the key was already warm in his palm, and the melody it sang seemed to drown out all other thoughts. This was what he had been looking for, though he hadn't realized he'd been searching. This was why he came to the midnight market, why he felt so restless in his ordinary life of ordinary locks and ordinary days. "How much?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "No price. This key belongs to you already. It always has." She paused, studying his face in the wavering light. "But I should warn you, once you use it, once you open what has been closed, there may be no closing it again." Songs have a way of following their singers, even when the singer doesn't remember the words. Theo closed his fingers around the key, feeling its weight, its warmth, the way it seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Around them, the midnight market continued its eternal dance of buying and selling, of whispers and wonders. But he felt suddenly alone with this choice. This moment balanced on the edge of before and after. "I understand," he said, though he wasn't certain he did. The woman nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. "The chest waits at the bottom of the fountain, when you're ready." She turned back to her other keys, her attention already shifting, to another customer who approached with hunger in their eyes. Theo walked to the fountain's edge, the bone key growing warmer in his palm with each step. The black water showed him nothing now but darkness, but somehow he could feel the presence of something beneath its surface, something that had been patient for a very long time. He knelt beside the stone rim, rolled up his sleeves, and reached into the water. It was warm, warmer than any night pool had a right to be, and his hand found the chest almost immediately, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface. The lock was ornate, carved from the same dark metal as the chest itself, and when he inserted the bone key, it fit perfectly. The key turned with a sound like a sigh, and the chest opened. Music poured out, not sound, but music made manifest, visible as golden threads that spiraled upward into the night sky. The melody was complex beyond anything Theo had ever heard, layered with harmonies that spoke of love and loss, of journeys undertaken and prices paid. It wound around him like silk scarves in a warm wind, and suddenly, impossibly, he was singing. Along, the words came from somewhere deep inside him, in a voice that was his, but richer, older. They were in a language he didn't recognize, but understood perfectly, telling a story of a locksmith who had loved a woman made of music, who had carved keys from his own bones to unlock the doors between worlds, who had paid a price measured, not in gold but in memory. When the song ended, the golden threads faded, but the melody remained humming quietly in the back of his mind, waiting. Theo withdrew his hands from the water, the empty chest sinking back into the depths, and looked around. The market seemed dimmer now, as if some essential light had gone out of it. Several of the vendors were staring at him with expressions he couldn't read. The woman with the bone keys was gone. Her stall had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving only an empty space and the faintest scent of roses on the night air. Theo stood slowly, the bone key still clutched in his hand, and realized that something fundamental had changed. The melody sang in his blood now, and he could feel it calling to him, drawing him toward something he couldn't yet name, as he walked toward the edge of the market, preparing to return to his ordinary world of ordinary locks. He didn't notice the way the other vendors watched him go, their eyes full of sorrow and something that might have been recognition. The first customer arrived at Theo's shop 3 days later, just as the morning mist was lifting from the harbor. She was an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and she claimed her name was Evelyn, though she said it like she wasn't entirely certain. Theo was working on a simple deadbolt repair, his hands moving with their usual steady precision, when the bell above his door chimed. The woman entered slowly, as if unsure of her welcome, and something about her bearing made him look up from his workbench. "I heard you singing," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a slight tremor that spoke of great age or great emotion. 3 nights ago, the old song, Theo's hands still on the lock mechanism. Since returning from the midnight market, the melody from the bone key had been his constant companion, humming quietly in the background of his thoughts. Sometimes, when he was focused on particularly intricate work, he found himself humming along, his voice finding harmonies he'd never known he could create, but he hadn't realized anyone else could hear it. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean," he said carefully. Setting down his tools, the woman stepped closer, her weathered hands clutching a small leather purse. "Oh, but you do. I can see it in your eyes. They have the look now, the look of someone who remembers." She paused at the counter, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to step back. "You found it, didn't you? The key that was waiting." A chill ran down Theo's spine. "How could you possibly know about that?" Evelyn smiled, and for a moment her face seemed to shimmer, as if he were seeing her through water. "Because I've been looking for you for 70 years. My locksmith, my love, my Marcus." Her voice broke on the last word. "You carved me a key, once, from your own rib bone, so that I could unlock the door to your heart. Do you remember?" The workshop seemed to tilt around him. The melody in his head grew stronger, and suddenly he could almost see it, a workshop lit by candles, hands that looked like his but weren't quite his, carving delicate patterns into white bone, while a woman with dark hair and storm-cloud eyes watched from the doorway. The memory felt real and false at the same time, like a dream recalled upon waking. "My name is Theo," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. "Theodore Aldrich. I'm 43 years old. I was born in this city. I've been a locksmith for 20 years. Yes," Evelyn said gently. "You are Theo now. But once, in another turn of the wheel, you were Marcus. And before that, you were Edmund. And before that, Johann, always a locksmith, always searching for the perfect lock, the one key that would open everything." She reached into her purse and withdrew something wrapped in faded silk. "You made this for me when we were young together, when we thought love was enough to unlock any door." She unwrapped the silk to reveal a key carved from bone, yellowed with age. Its surface covered in the same intricate script that had decorated the key from the midnight market. But this one was smaller, more delicate, and along its length were carved tiny flowers and birds, details so fine they seemed to breathe in the morning light. The moment Theo saw it, the melody in his head swelled, and he was no longer standing in his shop, but in that other workshop, the one he remembered and didn't remember, watching himself carve those tiny flowers while humming the same tune that now ran through his blood. "That's not possible," he whispered. Evelyn set the key on his counter with infinite care. "Love makes many impossible things possible, and loss makes them necessary." Her eyes filled with tears that looked silver in the morning light. "You don't remember yet, but you will." The song always brings the memories back in time. Why you keep being born, why you keep finding your way to locks and keys. You're searching for something you lost, something you need to unlock. Theo's legs felt suddenly unsteady. He groped for his work stool and sat heavily, staring at the bone key. "This is insane. People aren't reincarnated. Memories don't carry over between lives, don't they?" Evelyn asked softly. "Then why do you know how to carve bone, though you've never learned?" Why do your hands remember the weight of tools you've never owned? Why does that melody come so naturally to your voice when you've never heard it before? He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat, because she was right. Since finding the bone key at the midnight market, his fingers had been itching to carve, to shape, to create things far more complex than the simple lock repairs that formed his daily bread. And the melody felt like coming home. After a long journey, what happened to us? He heard himself ask. In that other life, what happened? Pain flickered across Evelyn's face. You were trying to create the perfect lock. One that would keep safe everything we held dear, our life together, our future. But perfect locks require perfect keys, and perfect keys. She touched the bone key on the counter. Perfect keys demand perfect sacrifice. The workshop fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of harbor bells. Theo found himself reaching for the bone key almost without thinking, his fingers tracing the carved flowers and birds. The moment he touched it, images flooded his mind, not memories, exactly, but impressions, feelings, the ghost of experiences that belonged to someone who wore his face, a woman with dark hair laughing as she brought him tea while he worked, the weight of carving tools in his hands, the satisfaction of shaping bone into beauty, the growing obsession with creating something permanent, something that could lock away love itself so it could never be lost. And then the night when everything went wrong, when the lock he'd created proved to be not a guardian but a prison, when the key he'd carved from his own bone demanded a price he hadn't understood until it was too late. You died, Evelyn whispered, as if reading his thoughts. The lock you made, it required the locksmith's life to seal it. You became part of it, part of the mechanism. And she drew a shaky breath. I spent the rest of my life trying to find a way to free you. When I died, I thought that would be the end. But love, it seems, is harder to kill than death itself. Theo looked up at her, seeing now not just an elderly woman, but someone who had carried a burden of love and loss for decades. And you think, I'm him, Marcus. I know you are. Your soul returns, life after life, always drawn to locks and keys, always searching for the one that will set you free. The song in that chest, the one you unlock, to the key to remember, to becoming whole again. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with hope and desperation. That's why I came, because this time, maybe this time, we can break the cycle. Before Theo could respond, the bell above his door chimed again. A man entered middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that spoke of wealth and authority. But his eyes, when he looked at Theo, held the same strange recognition that had marked Evelyn's gaze. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Theo couldn't place. "I'm looking for a locksmith. I heard singing 3 nights ago, and I wondered, ... He trailed off as he noticed Evelyn, and something passed between them. A look of shared knowledge that made Theo feel like an intruder in his own shop. "You heard it too," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. The man nodded. The old song, the one about doors that shouldn't be opened and prices that must be paid. He turned to Theo, studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. "You don't remember? Me, do you? I'm Thomas. In the life before last, You helped me hide something precious behind a lock that no one else could open. I've been carrying the key ever since, waiting for you to return." He reached into his jacket and withdrew yet another bone key, this one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and move when Theo looked at them directly. The melody in his head grew stronger still, and suddenly the workshop felt crowded with invisible presences, with the weight of lives lived and debts unpaid. "How many of you are there?" Theo asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Thomas and Evelyn exchanged glances. "Everyone you've ever helped," Thomas said quietly. "Everyone who ever owed you a debt of gratitude or love. We're all still here, waiting. The song calls us, life after life, until the debt is paid or the lock is opened." Theo stood abruptly, his stool scraping against the wooden floor. "This is madness. I'm not some reincarnated locksmith. I'm not responsible for things that happened, in lives I didn't live." But even as he spoke the words, part of him knew they weren't true. The bone key from the midnight market seemed to pulse in his pocket, warm against his leg, and the melody that had become his constant companion sang of responsibility and connection, of debts that transcended death and love that refused to stay buried. "You don't have to believe," Evelyn said gently. "Not yet. But they'll keep coming, all of them. Everyone who knew you, everyone who loved you, everyone who needs something unlocked. The song has woken something that's been sleeping, and now it will call until it's answered." As if to prove her point, the bell chimed again, and another figure entered, a young woman this time, with eyes like deep water and a smile that was both familiar and heartbreaking. In her hands, she carried a box carved from dark wood, and Theo could see even from across the room that its lock was made from bone. The melody in his head swelled to encompass all of them, weaving their separate threads into a harmony that spoke of connection, of purpose, of a story that had been interrupted but never ended. And Theo realized, with a mixture of fear and recognition, that his ordinary life of ordinary locks was over. The song had found him, and it would not let him go. The evening, 17 people had visited Theo's shop. They came alone and in pairs, young and old, carrying bone keys and locked boxes, antique chests and jewelry cases whose mechanisms had been waiting decades for the right hands to open them. Each one looked at him with that same expression of desperate hope, that same mixture of love and need that spoke of connections forged in lives he couldn't quite remember. Theo sat at his workbench as the sun set over the harbor, surrounded by an array of locks and keys unlike anything he'd ever encountered in his practical career. Some of the locks seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Others whispered when he drew near, and all of them hummed in harmony with the melody that had taken up permanent residence in his mind. Mrs. Chen had brought a music box that hadn't played in 40 years. "You gave this to my grandmother," she'd explain, her elderly hands trembling as she set it on the counter. She said it contained the song of her first love, locked away until the right person came to set it free. A man named David had carried, in a chest so heavy it had taken 3 people to move it from his truck. "My great-grandfather left this to me," he'd said, along with a note that said someday a locksmith would come who could open it without a key, who would know just by touching it what lay inside. And so it had gone, visitor after visitor, each carrying some piece of the puzzle that was his forgotten past. With each new arrival, the melody in Theo's head had grown more complex, adding new harmonies and counterpoints until it seemed his skull could barely contain the music. Now, alone with the accumulated mysteries of 7 lifetimes, Theo tried to make sense of what was happening to him. The practical part of his mind insisted this was all elaborate coincidence, perhaps some shared delusion brought on by mass hysteria, but his hands knew better. When he touched the locks these people brought, his fingers found mechanisms they'd never learned, understood principles that had never been taught to him. He picked up Mrs. Chen's music, feeling the weight of it in his palms. It was beautiful work, carved from what looked like cherry wood and inlaid with mother of pearl in patterns that seemed to flow like water. The lock was tiny but intricate, its keyhole shaped like a heart. When he examined it closely, he could see that it had been designed not just to keep the box closed, but to create a specific sound when open, as if the mechanism itself was part of the musical arrangement. Without thinking, he reached for his tools and began to work. His hands moved with a surety that should have frightened him, manipulating the lock's components with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. This wasn't the careful probing of a locksmith learning a new mechanism. This was the touch of someone who had built the thing in the first place, who knew every spring and tumbler because they had placed each one with deliberate care. The lock opened with a soft chime, and immediately the music box began to play. The melody that poured forth was heartbreakingly beautiful, simple waltz that seemed to capture all the sweetness of first love and all the sorrow of its ending. But underneath the main theme, Theo could hear something else, his own voice, humming the harmony he'd been carrying for days, as if the song in the music box had been composed specifically to complement the music in his head as the melody played. Images flickered through his mind like pages in a book blown by wind. A young woman in a blue dress, spinning in a garden, while cherry blossoms fell like snow. The same woman, older now, sitting by a window and watching the harbor with eyes full of longing. And always, in the background, the sound of his own voice, humming this exact melody while his hands carved and crafted and created. When the music box wound down, Theo found his cheeks were wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. "You remember now," said a voice from the doorway. Theo looked up to find Evelyn standing there, though he hadn't heard the bell. In the evening light, she looked younger somehow, or perhaps timeless, and her storm cloud eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. Some of it, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Fragments. She stepped into the shop, moving among the collected locks and keys, with the familiarity of someone returning to a beloved home. It takes time. The memories are layered, life upon life. Each time you're reborn, you start with a clean slate, but the deeper truth, the ones carved into the soul itself, those never really disappear. Theo set down the music box with careful reverence. How many times has this happened? How many lives have I lived as a locksmith? 7 that I know of, counting this one. Always the same pattern you're drawn to locks and keys. You develop an obsession with creating the perfect mechanism. You push beyond what should be possible. She picked up one of the bone keys from his counter, turning it over in her weathered hands, and always, eventually, you remember what you're really searching for, which is. Evelyn's smile was sad and knowing, the lock that will keep love safe forever. the one that will protect what matters most from loss, from death, from the simple passage of time. You've been trying to build it for centuries, Marcus. In every life, you get a little closer. The name fell on him like a familiar coat, settling around his shoulders with the weight of recognition. Marcus, yes, that felt right in a way that Theodore never quite had. But even as he accepted it, questions multiplied in his mind. If I've been trying for centuries, why haven't I succeeded? What keeps going wrong? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the carved patterns on the bone key. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because perfect locks require perfect keys, and perfect keys. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Perfect keys demand perfect sacrifice. Before he could ask what she meant, the melody in his head suddenly swelled, and the workshop around him seemed to shift and blur for a moment. He was standing not in his familiar space, but in that other workshop, the one from his fragmented memories. Candles flickered on the workbenches, casting dancing shadows on stone walls. The air smelled of bone dust and metal shavings, and his hands, younger hands, but unmistakably his, were carving delicate patterns into what looked like his own rib. I remember, he breathed. I was making a key for you, from my own bone, to unlock the perfect lock, Evelyn confirmed. The one that would keep our love safe forever. But when you carved the key from your own body, when you literally put part of yourself into the mechanism, it created a connection that couldn't be broken. The lock didn't just protect our love, became our love. And when you died to power it, you became trapped within it. The vision faded, leaving Theo standing in his ordinary workshop, surrounded by extraordinary locks. But now he understood why the melody had called to so many people, why they all carried pieces of his past in the form of keys and boxes and mechanisms he'd created. Each lock was a fragment of his soul, a piece of the perfect mechanism he'd been trying to build across lifetimes. Where is it? He asked. The original lock, the one that started all this. Evelyn hesitated, and in that pause, Theo heard the answer in the way the assembled locks began to hum in harmony, their separate melodies weaving together into something larger and more complex. It's not in one place, she said finally, when you died, when the lock was completed, but couldn't hold what it was meant to protect. It, scattered, broke apart into all the smaller locks you've made since, spread across the world, carried by everyone whose life you've touched. Each key, each mechanism, each music box and jewelry chest, they're all fragments of the original. Theo looked around his workshop with new eyes, seeing not a collection of random antiques, but the scattered pieces of his own soul, brought together by people who had been waiting lifetimes for him to remember. And if I could gather them all, if I could reassemble the perfect lock, then you could finally unlock what you've been trying to protect, Evelyn said. But Marcus Theo, the price would be the same as it was before. Perfect locks require perfect keys, and perfect keys demand perfect sacrifice, he finished. The melody in his head was growing stronger now, more insistent, and he could feel the assembled locks responding to it, their separate songs beginning to merge into something that was almost but not quite complete. How many pieces are missing? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Just one. The heart of it all, the central mechanism that holds everything together. She reached into her bag and withdrew something wrapped in black silk. I've carried it with me through every life, waiting for the day when you'd be ready to use it. She unwrapped the silk to reveal a key unlike any of the others. This one was carved not from bone, but from what looked like crystal, clear as water, but with a faint inner radiance that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Along its length were etched symbols that seemed to move and shift, telling a story of love and loss, creation and destruction, endings that were also beginning. The moment he saw it, every lock in the workshop began to sing. The sound was overwhelming, not loud, but so complex and layered that it seemed to fill every corner of his mind. Each lock contributed its own voice to the harmony, creating a symphony that spoke of completion, of purpose, of a story that had been waiting centuries to reach its conclusion. And Theo understood, with a clarity that was both terrible and beautiful, what he would have to do. The midnight market had changed. When Theo arrived, carrying a satchel filled with bone keys and crystal harmonies, he found the familiar circle of stalls transformed into something altogether more profound. The vendors were all there, the mirror seller, the merchant of bottled emotions, the woman who traded in forgotten names, but they stood now in perfect silence, their faces turned toward the fountain at the market's heart. The fountain itself had become something else entirely. The black water that had once reflected deeper things now swirled with currents of light, gold and silver threads that moved in patterns too complex for the eye to follow. And rising from its center, where the ancient chest had once rested, was a structure that took Theo's breath away. It was a lock, not merely large, but impossibly intricate, carved from the same dark stone as the fountain itself. Its surface was covered with keyholes of every size and shape, from delicate heart-shaped openings to massive slots that could accommodate keys the size of swords. Some keyholes glowed with their own inner light. Others seemed to absorb the illumination around them, and all of them sang in the harmony that had become the soundtrack of his existence. "It's magnificent," breathed Evelyn, who had arrived moments before him with the crystal key clutched against her chest. "Even more beautiful than I remember." Around the market's perimeter, others had gathered all the people who had visited his shop over the past days, along with dozens more he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. They stood in a great circle, each holding some fragment of his scattered soul, keys and boxes, music mechanisms and jewelry chests, all the locks he'd created across 7 lifetimes of searching. As Theo approached the fountain's edge, the melody in his head reached a crescendo, and suddenly he could see them all, every life he'd lived, every attempt he'd made to create the perfect lock. Johann the Locksmith in medieval Prague, spending decades perfecting clockwork mechanisms of impossible complexity. Edmund the craftsman in Renaissance Florence, carving keys from exotic materials and imbuing them with properties that bordered on the miraculous. Marcus the locksmith in Victorian London, driven to the edge of madness by his obsession with protecting the one thing that mattered most. In every life, the same pattern. In every life, the same ending. "You know what happens now," said a voice behind him. Theo turned to find the woman from the bone key stall. Though she looked different, now older and younger at once, her features shifting subtly in the market's ethereal light. Her eyes held the weight of centuries, and when she smiled, he saw in that expression all the love and sorrow of a universe built on sacrifice and transformation. You're not just a vendor, he realized. You're part of this, part of me, she nodded. Slowly, I am what you created when you first attempted the perfect lock, the keeper of possibilities, the guardian of what might be. Every locksmith needs someone to hold the keys while they work. After all, the crystal key in Evelyn's hands began to pulse more rapidly, its light growing stronger with each beat of Theo's heart. Around the circle, the assembled crowd raised the fragments of his soul, and the great lock in the fountain's center responded with a symphony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. It's time, the keeper said softly. Time to complete what you began so long ago. Theo looked at the massive lock, at the hundreds of keyholes that covered its surface like stars in a night sky. Each one was different, shaped to accept a specific key from the collection now held by the people who had loved him across lifetimes. The harmony they created together was almost complete, but not quite. The crystal key, he said, understanding, flooding through him like a warm tide. It's not meant to open the lock. It's meant to complete it. Evelyn stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. It's the key to the heart of it all, the central mechanism that will make everything else possible. But Theo Marcus, you know what using it means. He did know, had always known, even when he'd forgotten everything else. The crystal key wasn't carved from bone or metal or stone. It was carved from something far more precious, from love itself, from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the chance to protect what mattered most.